That's from a movie, I think it came out in the early 70s. Australian, kind of a surf cult. People who surf, people who are really into surfing might have heard of it. It's old now though, but it was a classic. I guess there's no dialogue and no script. It's just the soundtrack and yeah, I think mostly images of people surfing and the lifestyle that they led, which was, according to the movie, very much in harmony with the earth. It's kind of an environmental movie, actually. Anybody ever gets a chance to see it, I would strongly recommend it. I haven't seen it. I've just seen a few clips. It's got a really good soundtrack. Anyway, something about surfing. Surfing could easily be viewed as a form of virtue ethics. You might think, well, that's odd. You know, it's just surfing. It's recreation. It's outdoor. A lot of these outdoor recreations, though. But surfing kind of is quintessentially a virtue ethic sort of path of life. You know, because you have to gain unity with the wave. And the wave eventually begins to attain a greater metaphysical status, and an emotional and intellectual status that you master, right? You master the wave, with your balance, the integrity of your body. You achieve stability on the wave, and that's kind of a metaphor for life. You know, for the wave of sentiment that we all ride as we go through life and the things that go on between us, right? And if you've got that balance, though, then you can. That's foreshadowing ahead quite a ways, but it's also going way back to the ancient Greeks, who are all about beauty, and something very beautiful, obviously, too, about these images. Anyway, right? There's something beautiful. There's something reflective of harmony, and sort of a primordial harmony with the planet. If you go so far as to realize that the motion of the waves is strongly influenced, even determined by the movements of the moon, So arguably the surfer is connected to the moon, too. But to achieve that kind of balance, right, in the rest of your life, right, is ideally what a virtue ethic teaches us. And a lot of virtue ethics have that strong physical component, like yoga, right? Yoga is a virtue ethic, form of virtue ethics. Yoga means unity, right? And actually what's interesting is if you watch that clip that I showed you real carefully where they're showing the guys where they live, and they're having their little fire and cooking their food and playing their little flutes and stuff. And there's a little, real short, if you're not watching real closely, you don't see it, but there's a yoga book. There's a book about yoga on the shelf. And when I saw that, that made sense. Wow, that makes sense, that surfers would be into yoga. Because they're both virtue ethics, they both involve this strong physical component of mastering, mastering the physical dimensions of your being, but that's only a prelude to mastering the more subtle metaphysical dimensions, right? And yoga ultimately means unity with the universe, and that's something you achieve through meditation after you're done doing all the poses, right? So, anyway, presumably you could say the same thing about surfing, right? So, the ultimate unity you achieve as a surfer is not necessarily when you're on the wave, although that's maybe when you experience it most intensely. But throughout the rest of your life, you cultivate that unity. And as your physical body fails, perhaps your intellectual body, your spirit, your soul, perhaps, starts to covet that beauty, and you learn to experience it in new ways, as you can't experience it physically anymore. Anyway, fascinating stuff. So I'll try to remember to get this attendance sheet going around. And today we can just try to figure out what the big deal is. It's really a simple question. The Endangered Species Act was passed by Congress, signed by President Richard M. Nixon in 1972. It's kind of when all the congressional environmentalist-inspired congressional activity in this country, most of it, obviously there was, the conservation movement, accomplished a lot. The Wilderness Act, actually, of 1964 is sort of the culmination of the conservation movement, and that's also sort of segue into where conservationism kind of segues into environmentalism. In the early, Rachel Carson publishes her famous book Silent Spring, and even though that's all about not primarily, it's about how chemicals, how human anthropogenic chemicals have seriously harmed our biotic communities and are harming ourselves in the process. That was published in 1962, and most historians tend to agree that it was sort of a confluence of Leopold and Carson that brought a lot of popular attention to the ecology and to the idea that we have obligations to the natural world other than just protecting all the pretty places, which is largely what the conservation movement was about, right? In terms of all its major victories, they all revolved around really special, pretty places, right? That were generally far away. A good example of that was the Dinosaur National Monument, the fight to preserve those I think there were 2 dams proposed that would have flooded 2 very nice areas, but they were remote, far away from everything. Whereas at the same time period, the Corps of Engineers was constructing the Dalles Dam and was holding hearings about the Dalles Dam, and not a single representative of an environmental organization even showed up, evidently because it wasn't far enough away. It was pretty, but it was also pretty in an indigenous, the indigenous people thought it was really pretty, and that was kind of a mark against it, and they wanted to drive the indigenous people off the river too, which of course they didn't succeed in doing. But anyway, that's just an interesting contrast. Those 2 historical events were going on at the same time, and the Sierra Club and all these other leading environmentalist groups, and there were many of them in the 30s. Over 30 different environmental groups got together to put a stop to what the Bureau of Reclamation was planning to do in Dinosaur National Monument. And meanwhile, the Army Corps of Engineers, another federal agency, was destroying Celilo Falls and inundating treaty-reserved fishing sites. That had been clearly reserved in the treaties. It's so strange to think, it's not strange, right? Ultimately, if you realize what was going on in that time period. But all of these, every single traditional fishing site of the tribes that signed the Stevens Treaties is underwater. Of the Mid-Columbia, right? There are 2 different groups, generally geographically. There's the group around Puget Sound. A bunch of tribes there signed the Stevens Treaties. And this is 1854, 1855, right? They all have this famous clause. About 19 treaties total, I think. They all have this famous clause. And some of them are with a group of bands or a group of tribes. They're not all just with individual tribes. Anyway, they all reserve to the signatory tribes, to said Indians, the right and reserve the right to harvest fish at all usual and accustomed places in common with citizens of the territory. And what that means, I'll have a lecture on this. I don't know when I'll squeeze it in. It might be listed somewhere on the syllabus, but a lecture on Northwest Indigenous Treaty Fishing Rights. But ironically, not ironically, it's just amazing to think that's what the language says, right? The right to harvest fish at all usual and custom sites. And that means off reservation, right? And courts have long agreed, and that's what it means. It means, everyone knows that. It means not just the places on their reservations. They have total control over those, right? They can exclude non-Indians on their own reservations from harvesting fish, right? And they can't exclude them off their reservation. They can, anyway, and those places are very small, right? Their little reserves, that we call reservations, are minuscule compared to how much territory, traditional territory, that each of these tribes gave up. Right? And so if they can demonstrate, which is very easy to do, that they used to harvest fish at a certain site on the Columbia or the Snake River or one of the tributaries, then they have a right to go there, and they can cross people's private land, and they can set up their platforms, and they can harvest fish, and they can camp there for weeks at a time if need be, dry their fish, smoke their fish, etc. And that's all protected by the treaties, right? And yet, meanwhile, the Army Corps of Engineers from Bonneville Dam all the way up has turned the entire Columbia River, with the exception of the Hanford Reach, which I don't think is part of the mid-Columbia plateaus. It might be part of their traditional fishing area. Anyway, they've plugged up the whole river, right? And basically, not just basically, but in reality, every single one of those usual and accustomed places from Bonneville up is under 40 to 60 feet of water, right? Including the most famous place of all, the place that had the highest concentration of fishing sites, Celilo Falls, which wasn't just one fall, it was a whole series of falls. Anyway, so while all these things, in the highlight of the North American environmental movement in the mid-20th century leading up to give him credit, right? I mean, Aldo Leopold wormed his way ultimately all the way into a decision by a Supreme Court Chief Justice. That's the only instance, by the way, that the dissenting opinion in Sierra Club versus Morton that I read to you, was it last week or Tuesday? Probably last week. Anyway, it's the only instance in which any Supreme Court justice or any federal judge, as far as I know, any federal judge at any level has affirmed in a dissenting opinion, right? Which you might say doesn't count much, but if you look at all the great cases where our Supreme Court changed something very fundamental in its view of, like, slavery, for example. The first few cases that the Supreme Court had to hear on whether or not human beings could own other human beings, there were always one or two dissenting justices, but the majority would stamp approval on that, right? And eventually, though, the dissenting justice's view came to be adopted by the majority. So you might say, it's nothing. The guy was already an environmentalist. He was a member for a while. He was on the board of directors of the Sierra Club, for heaven's sakes. So you might discount it. But still, I mean, that's the moment where the notion that ecological wholes not only should be given legal status, but also have, because they have some moral status, and that's why they should be given legal status. That idea wormed its way all the way up, to the Supreme Court, which is really kind of amazing. So now we're going to try to make sense of the view that says that our obligations to ecological wholes are rooted in, well, I don't want to get too far ahead. Rooted in an understanding of how ecosystems, we've already been through this, right? We're now trying to develop the Rolston is his own philosopher, right? He writes a little bit about Leopold, but he's really doing his own thing. But in a way, you could also read Leopold, as we have done so far, as being something of a neo-Kantian, insofar as he is saying that an ecological whole has to be practically respected by a land, air, water, wildlife manager, right? An ecological whole has to be practically respected, and we don't know what that means. We're always going to determine what that means on a case-by-case basis. But the idea is that you have to respect the integrity, stability, and beauty, perhaps in some sense, of an ecological whole. And once you act in a way that disrespects the integrity, stability, and beauty of an ecological whole, then you are impermissibly instrumentalizing the ecological whole. And then you have to back up a ways, right? And today maybe we have to try to zero in on and make more sense about the notion that an ecological whole has moral status of its own. We still haven't really been able to fully defend what that means, and it may be because so far we've been chained to this subjectivist meta-ethic, right? So far we've been not chained, but I mean, we've been studying the neo-Kantians for already. This is an extension of the neo-Kantians, right? And this, by the way, is another changing. We're changing course now dramatically. This is the end of our little journey into metaphysics. Okay, this is kind of the last leg of our metaphysical journey today. All right, and we're going to try to finally make sense of the claim that an ecological whole has moral status such that humans are obligated. Okay, so we have to explain first what Rolston calls the intrinsic value. He's happy to use the term intrinsic, and he would say that, Collicutt's trying to equivocate by using the term inherent, right? Remember the light in the refrigerator theory? Collicutt wants to say that morality, moral norms about the natural world evolved biologically, okay? But he recognizes that culture is needed in order to confer inherent value on an ecosystem. So he kind of wants to, but he insists that moral norms evolve biologically. And you might ask, well, how else could they evolve? Rolston says, basically, they evolve culturally. And we as a special organism with these awesome powers of rationality have developed this very sophisticated human culture which is categorically distinct. The evolution of human culture is a distinct new development in the evolution of life on Earth. And humans have this unique capacity to recognize the physical and the moral laws that pertain to our relationships with ecological wholes. Okay? And as soon as we recognize those physical and moral laws that pertain to our relationships with ecological wholes, Rolston says we have to adopt we automatically begin to recognize that we have obligations too. Okay? It seems like kind of a mysterious move. I mean, the advantage of Collicutt's explanation is he says, okay, we need sentiment, right? We need emotion. We need motivation. We need emotivation in order to have a, maybe I shouldn't stamp my foot, but in order to have a binding obligation to something, right, we have to be emotively connected to it, okay? And so he wants to say, science can teach us that there's enough amazing things going, there are enough amazing things perhaps going on, all the interconnections in the natural world. Science teaches us that we can come to have a sentimental attachment to ecological wholes. It not only teaches us that we can do that, right? It's an ecological possibility, it's an evolutionary possibility, it's an ecological necessity too, right? And so culture comes along with its science and its ecology, and it recognizes that humans are best served if they confer moral status onto ecosystems, right? And species. Today I should try to always focus in on species, because I asked you to read just a very narrow essay, right? Rolston goes on in his other work and wants to talk about duties to ecosystems, duties to the earth as a whole, right? But today we'll just try to keep it as simple as possible by talking about duties to endangered species specifically. Duties, obviously, that are of a very, and this should have been perfectly clear to you after all the journey that we've taken so far, very, very different than the kind of explanation for our duties to species that we find in Wilson, right? Wilson is the other great champion, right? He's devoted his entire career to focusing on the scientific and non-scientific benefits of preserving genetic lineages, right? Species and subspecies, right? And yet he candidly says that he's offering us an anthropocentric explanation, and he thinks that's all we need and that's all we're ever going to get, right? Because of his metaethic, right? Rolston rejects that metaethic, says that metaethic is misguided, and gives us instead an objectivistic metaethic, right? In which the values of species are evident they're also evident with respect, with reference to how they benefit us long term. Okay, that's Collicutt and that's Wilson's explanation, right? Not Collicutt's explanation. He's a little different. Collicutt's like a hybrid between the subjectivist, because he's a Darwinian, right? And then you might ask, well, isn't Rolston a Darwinian? Actually, in a very important sense, he isn't. And then you might ask, well, where do our obligations come from? Okay? And then you might start getting really suspicious, and those of you who have been brought up to be suspicious of any kind of religious inclination or religious sentiment might take note of the fact that our new buddy Rolston has some pretty strong religious convictions. And you might start to wonder if he isn't relying on some traditionally religiously grounded notion like conscience, and he probably is. And he's probably saying that humans have some very special faculty that other animals don't have, as far as we know, right? Some of them might, but we haven't developed communication with them sufficiently to know whether they actually do or not. But humans have this remarkable capacity to recognize moral obligations. And that is something that evolved culturally. So the wolves, remember the wolf-centric moral norm, the system of, the wolf-centric system of moral norms that wolves operate on that obligates them, or certainly permits them, and sometimes probably obligates them to kill, to murder, right? To murder a member of their own species, right? Different pack, but a member of their own species. According to Collicutt's Leopold, according to the Darwinists, there is no categorical difference between the origin of our human moral obligations and the origin, right? They both emerged evolutionarily, right? Through adaptive fit. But Rolston wants to say, no, humans have this extra layer of evolution that we conveniently call cultural evolution. And our obligations emerge from our cultural endowments, and not from our obligations toward other humans might well have emerged along the lines that David Hume and Darwin identify. But the limits of that development are anthropocentric, right? Because our moral sentiments develop with the idea that we're all moral agents, and yet an ecological whole cannot be viewed as a moral agent, right? And so we can't explain the idea that we have moral obligations to ecological wholes until we introduce the idea that humans are sort of developing this perfect map of how ecosystems work. Right? And that's a very neo-Kantian sort of idea, right? Once humans understand how an ecosystem works, then they realize that their relationship to that ecosystem gives them certain binding obligations, right? All right, so let's dig into Rolston a little bit. So he's getting on in years. He's probably been retired for a while now, but I think he still writes. I've read some of his very recent essays, and he does seem to be struggling a little bit. He's not as fluent as he once was. As one can imagine, he's now, 84 years old. But he has a very interesting background, because he comes out of this Presbyterian, Christian family, I guess. I don't know that much about him, really. I'm told that he is pretty dedicated. I don't know if he still gives sermons. I don't know if he has his own church somewhere. I'm not sure, really. But I'm told that he takes his faith very seriously. But obviously, he's totally, he's not one of these religious people who views a conflict with science and religion, right? I mean, he's totally down with Darwin and evolution and and the age of the Earth, right? The very ancient Earth. 5 billion years old, or is that when life started? Anyway, he totally accepts all of that, obviously. So don't try to portray him as some kind of a nutcase, religiously speaking. He's been teaching philosophy, so I guess he got a master's degree in philosophy of science, and then he went on and got a PhD in philosophy. Or maybe he never did, actually. Anyway, he's been teaching philosophy in philosophy departments at a secular Western university, Colorado State, since 1968. One interesting part of his, this is his greatest accomplishment. If you're a philosopher who specializes in philosophy of religion, in any sense, in any sense at all, right? You don't have to be a theologian, and you are invited. You just, some sort of philosopher who's investigating aspects of religious experience, like William James did, and he published his Gifford Lectures in, I believe, 1899, and then almost 100 years later. I think 99 years later, maybe exactly 100 years later, Holmes Rolston also. The Gifford Lectures are named after some rich guy in Scotland whose last name was Gifford, and he left a bunch of money to the University of Edinburgh to endow annual lecture series on the philosophy of religion and some related topics. And so if your expertise, all the heavyweights, if you look at a list of the philosophers delivered the Gifford Lectures, they're all the heavyweights, right? So Holmes Rolston was invited to deliver the Gifford Lectures in 1998-99. He was also awarded this Templeton Prize, which I'm told is more valuable. I mean, he got a bunch of money, basically, over $1 million, which he gave away, obviously, to some kind of a charity. But it's named the Templeton Prize for progress toward research or discoveries about spiritual realities. In any event, Rolston strikes me as a pretty conservative guy. Really quite. I really don't know very much about him, but he's also a lifelong backpacker. If you go to the Colorado State archives, like their digital archives, and they've changed things around in the last couple years, so I can't tell you exactly how to access this, but I would be surprised if his essay, everything he's published except for his books, he's got maybe 7 or 8 books, and then a whole bunch of, hundreds and hundreds of essays, some of which are theological, right, in theology, and many of which, about half and half from what I understand. I haven't read any of his essays on theology. But what was I going to say? anyway, you can access all of his material. And one thing that you can access is he would keep journals of all his backpacking trips that he took with his family in the Rocky Mountains mostly in the 1960s. And he actually has all these up there on the website too. So he's quite a fascinating guy. But in terms of where he's coming from, ethically, as I mentioned last class, these philosophers, along the farther we get to the right end of our spectrum of normative traditions, the more the thinker accepts the view that morality is objectively structured in the universe, right? That the moral law, just the idea that there is such a thing, right, is something you tend to encounter from a natural law theorist or a deontologist, right? And so, in this fundamental sense, Rolston is a very conservative figure, right? Because he's saying that if you pay attention, the way he does, to what's going on in a biotic community or in an ecosystem, then you come to recognize that there are certain moral laws and obligations which simply go along with the fact that we are embodied and that we are interrelated, right? That we are embodied biologically in the world and that we are ecologically interrelated. And that's a very kind of fundamentally conservative view. I teach this other class called Philosophy of Sex and Love, and generally speaking, where these traditions come down on issues related to the bedroom, on issues related to sexual relationships and even abortion, anything related to sex, basically, the thinkers who are self-described cultural conservatives end up identifying metaethically with the position that's very similar, if not identical, to the one that Rolston's identifying with. Namely, of course, Rolston is much more ecologically and biologically informed, but the idea that nature gives us certain firm guidelines, right? In this case, with Rolston, it's not nature, it's not plants and animals and all that stuff. It's the nature of knowledge that gives us our hard and fast obligations, okay? It's the structure of epistemic space, as contributed to, especially by ecologists and biologists, right? All these Enlightenment thinkers have taught us what the space of knowledge of our relationship to ecological wholes consists of, right? What does that epistemic space consist of? And now we know that there are all these relationships, right? If we put too much of the wrong stuff up into the atmosphere, we know that the hard and fast laws of physics and chemistry determine that certain consequences will result. And so, if we want to watch out for our long-term future, that means we also have moral obligations, right? To not put a bunch of stuff into our atmosphere. All right, so Rolston's basic idea, metaethically, is that values in nature and human obligations are objectively real and objectively knowable. Objective values are intrinsic, all these different levels. Rolston's, if you read his other work, you'll see that he's constantly trying to explain to us why the first one is obvious, right? But why at all these different levels, objectively real and objectively knowable values are manifest. Okay? And the valuability of these different of all these different kinds of entities, right, at all these different levels is independent of human valuing. And then he has, this kind of stirring language. All the quotes are going to be from a different essay called Value in Nature and the Nature of Value, which I normally assign to this class, but you guys got kind of a break because the one that I asked you to read is shorter and probably easier. But in this other essay, the nature of Value in Nature and the Nature of Value, Rolston says there is law without a lawgiver, history without a historian, biology without biologists, physics without physicists, creativity without creators, story without storytellers, and value without valuers. A sentient valuer is not necessary for value. The axiological scales we construct do not constitute value any more than the scientific scales we erect create what we thereby measure. There's that famous photo that actually Rolston writes about. He's written about in several different essays. It's the first photo of Earth from outside Earth, from space. And it changed our culture profoundly, just this image. So humans, according to Rolston, are not so much lighting up value. Remember the light in the refrigerator theory? Rolston's responding directly to Collicutt and to the subjectivists, including all these other thinkers that we've read that I tend to admire, like all the thinkers in the Hume, Smith, Darwin, Leopold line of moral reasoning. And that would include all the American philosophers, the pragmatists, and the environmental pragmatists. So Rolston is kind of throwing down the gauntlet against all these other thinkers, right? And he's championing, which is why we read him, because he's the most consistent meta-ethical objectivist out there among all these environmental ethicists. Humans are not so much lighting up value in a merely potentially valuable world. That would be Collicutt, right? Collicutt's opening the door to a refrigerator that's dark until the hand of Anthropos comes along, the magical hand, right, with the cultural recognition of the interrelatedness of everything. And then, but not until then, right, does it have anything like moral value, okay? But Rolston says, nope, that's not a correct account. That's an incorrect account of what's happening